Imagine being born the son of one of the richest men in an entire country, and choosing, with your own hands, to walk away from silk, sheets and chauffeurs into a barracks that smells of sweat, oil, and fear. Imagine having the future of millions on your shoulders. And just 12 short months before the country explodes. That is the story of Chukwuemeka Odumegwu Ojukwu, a boy of almost ridiculous privilege, who decided to gamble everything in a race, against time, and against a rival who would one day sit across a table and claim the same country he was determined to save. It begins far from the marble floors of Lagos in 1933, in a small railway town in northern Nigeria called Zungeru. The air there is thick with red dust and the whistle of trains. British colonial officers stride across platforms in pressed khaki, while porters, black, barefoot, invisible, haul their luggage. In one of the neat colonial houses near the station, a baby boy is born on November 4th. He is named Chukwuemeka, God has done well, and his father, Louis Odumegwu Ojukwu, takes the name as proof that destiny is on their side. Louis is not just any father. By the time little Emeka can walk, Louis is already becoming a legend, a transport magnate who builds a business empire out of lorries, at coal, commodities, and sheer will. In a society where most people never see a bank account, he is one of the first Nigerian millionaires. He drives imported cars, wears tailored suits, dines with colonial officials who privately think of him as an exception, a good native. Outside his mansion walls, children play barefoot in the rain. Inside, young Emeka plays with toy soldiers on polished floors, arranging them into lines and columns, pushing them forward in imaginary battles. The contrast is brutal, even to a child. When the family moves to Lagos, the city is a living contradiction. Mansions in Ikoyi, glowing with electric light, and, just a few, streets away, crowded shacks built from corrugated iron and scrap wood. Drivers shout in a chaos of bicycles and lorries. Street traders balance entire shops on their heads. At night, Emeka hears music drift in from the servants' quarters, and the low murmur of arguments about taxes, about the white man, about a future no one can describe clearly. He is too young to understand, but old enough to feel something is wrong. Louis wants his son insulated from all that. He sends him to the best schools available to an African boy in Lagos, places like King's College, where the discipline is British, and the curriculum is soaked in the history of the empire. The classrooms smell of chalk and sweat. The walls carry maps stained in red, the color used to mark territories belonging to Britain. Day after day, young Emeka listens to lessons about the glory of faraway kings and queens, and hears almost nothing about the people living just outside the school's high walls. Then, one afternoon, the thin line between privilege and humiliation snaps. He is 13. It is 1946. A British teacher, red-faced and impatient, drags a market woman into the school courtyard. She's small, wrapped in a faded wrapper, barefoot. She has been accused of stealing, or perhaps of arguing too loudly with a shopkeeper. The details blur with time, but the image does not. Before a ring of boys in neatly ironed uniforms, the teacher spits words like bullets. "You people, savages, uncivilized." The woman stands there, eyes burning, silent. Something catches fire in Emeka's chest. He watches the man's hand rise, as if he might strike her, and something inside refuses to accept it. This is not one of the faceless porters at the railway station. This is his mother's age, his people's dignity. He steps forward. The slap he delivers is not loud. It is nothing compared to the thunder of colonial guns. But it echoes in that courtyard like an explosion. A boy, an African boy, has just struck a white teacher. For a second, the entire structure of the empire seems to freeze. The consequences are swift and brutal. Emeka is seized, dragged out, locked in a cell. 13 years old and already in prison. The walls smell of damp and urine. Through the tiny window, he can see the sky turning from blue to black. Fear creeps in. Fear of his father's reaction, fear of being expelled, fear that his whole life might have just collapsed over a moment of anger. Louis arrives not as a sympathetic father, but as a man whose carefully constructed bridge to the colonial elite is suddenly on fire. He is furious. How could his son, the heir to a fortune, risk everything for a nameless market woman? Emeka listens to the shouting, the threats, the disappointment, and feels, under the fear, a strange calm. He would do it again. The humiliation of that woman had felt like a slap across his own face. He is expelled. The story spreads quickly through Lagos. The millionaire's boy who hit a white teacher. Some whispered in admiration, others in disbelief. For the colonial authorities, it is a problem that needs to be sent far away. For Louis, it is a stain that must be washed clean. The solution they agree on is simple. Exile by education. Emeka is packed off to England. Imagine the shock. The bright, humid chaos of Lagos, replaced by the gray, damp corridors of an English boarding school. The first time he sees snow, it is not magical. It is cold, wet, and reminds him that he is far from home. At Epsom College, he is one of the very few African boys. In the dining hall, conversations stop when he walks past. Some classmates are curious, some are polite, some cannot hide their contempt. He hears the whispers, colonial, native, black boy. He responds with the only weapons he has at that age, intelligence and discipline. He buries himself in books, devouring the histories of revolutions and empires, collapsing from within. He studies Latin, philosophy, political theory. He learns that every empire, no matter how vast, carries in it the seeds of its own destruction. Quietly, he begins to map those seeds onto the Nigeria he left behind. From Epsom, he moves to Oxford, to Lincoln College, to study history. In the library's hushed silence, under the gaze of portraits of dead Englishmen, Emeka reads about the American Revolution, about the French Revolution, about colonized peoples who had decided enough. He debates in student societies, sharpens his voice in his arguments. He watches how British aristocrats speak, dress, negotiate. He is learning the language of power, even as he plans to challenge it. Time is moving fast. The world is changing. India has already broken free in 1947. Across Africa, rumblings of independence grow louder. In London, Nigerian politicians meet in back rooms, arguing over constitutions and regional boundaries. The British, weakened by war, can feel their grip loosening. The map on the wall is slowly losing its red. For Louis, every letter from England is a report card on his investment. He imagines his son returning to Lagos, taking a position in the booming family business, dining with ambassadors, helping to build a Nigeria where the Odumegwu name stands for power in both pounds and prestige. For Emeka, though, another path is slowly taking shape. He returns to Nigeria in the mid-1950s, armed with an Oxford degree and a mind full of history. Lagos welcomes him like a prince returned. The city has grown even more restless. More cars, more banners calling for independence, more arguments in the bars and on street corners. He's still only in his 20s, but the weight of expectations settles on his shoulders like armor. His first move shocks almost everyone who knows him. Instead of stepping straight into the family business, he joins the civil service of the Eastern region. He becomes a district officer, one of the men who actually run the machinery of government that ordinary people encounter. Taxes, roads, permits. Some assume he got the job because of his father's name. They expect him to be lazy, arrogant, a big man's son who lets others do the real work. They are wrong. Emeka throws himself into the job. He travels to rural towns in the east, where the roads are little more than tracks in the red earth, and the night is so dark you can see every star. In village meetings held under trees, he listens to farmers, traders, elders. He hears complaints about corrupt policemen, crooked contractors, distant politicians in Lagos, who seem more interested in British approval than in clean water or functioning schools. He files reports that are sharper than what his superiors are used to, reports that name names and demand changes. Inside him, a realization is forming, hard and clear. Paperwork alone will not change Nigeria fast enough. In committee rooms in Enugu, he watches politicians bicker over budgets, while the clock of independence ticks down. The British have set a rough timetable. Nigerian leaders argue about constitutions, while the real ground of power begins to shift. The days of the colonial governor are numbered. Something else is coming. Emeka sees it in the way military officers in starched uniforms stride through airports, how their presence makes policemen snap to attention. There is a moment, small, almost quiet, that marks a turning point. In a meeting in the Eastern Civil Service, a senior official dismisses his passionate argument for faster local reforms with a lazy wave. Young man, be patient. Things will change in time. The words hang in the air like a sentence. In time. But history has taught Ojukwu something else. When you are not the one holding power, in time often means never. The twist is brutal for his father. The millionaire's son decides to become a soldier. In 1957, Chukwuemeka Odumegwu Ojukwu joins the Nigerian army. To Louis, it feels like betrayal. The army is not yet the respected national institution it will later claim to be. It is still seen by many as a colonial extension, a place for men with fewer options, not for Oxford graduates. Why trade tailored suits for uniforms, boardrooms for barracks? Why walk into a hierarchy still dominated by British officers, with all the casual racism that implies? For Emeka, the answer is simple and unforgiving. In a country racing toward independence, the men with guns will soon be the ones, defining the limits of politics. If he wants to shape Nigeria's future, he has to stand where the real power will be when the British flag finally comes down. The army strips him down to basics. In training depots and on parade grounds, rank means nothing at first. You are just another body to be pushed, shouted at, broken and rebuilt. The boots are heavy, the days long, the nights shorter. British sergeants bark orders that cut through the humid air. Sweat runs into his eyes as he repeats drills again and again under the sun. He has to earn respect in a double sense. As a recruit, and as a man from a background many of his comrades will never know. Some whisper that he will quit after a few months, that a man used to air-conditioned offices will not endure the mud. Instead, he digs in. He outmarches, outstudies, outshoots. When he's sent for further military training, including time at the famous Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, he absorbs strategy, the way he once absorbed history. In the officer mess, a new kind of rivalry emerges, not yet deadly but electric. Among the young Nigerian officers, men from different regions measure each other silently. There is the quiet, analytical Emeka from the East, with his university education and his stubborn pride. There is a gifted younger officer from the North, Yakubu Gowon, whose path will one day collide head-on with his. In training exercises, they compete to produce the best plans, the cleanest maneuvers. On the parade square, they both know that one day, if the politicians fail, it will be men like them who are called to take control. Time is still ticking. By 1960, Nigeria is free, at least on paper. The Union Jack is lowered. The green-white-green flag rises to the sound of cheers and a new anthem. Fireworks light up the Lagos sky. In the crowds, people dance and cry and drink, hugging strangers, shouting, "Independence! We are free!" For a moment, it feels like history has turned a page cleanly. In the barracks, Ojukwu watches the celebrations with a more complicated gaze. He knows that the British may have left, but they have left behind an army trained in their image, a civil service structured in their interests, and regional divisions sharpened by decades of divide and rule. The politicians, many of them his father's acquaintances, now have to manage a country as vast as Western Europe with borders drawn by people who never lived there. As he rises through the ranks to command positions in the north, he sees firsthand what those artificial lines mean. In cities like Kano, he commands troops in a region where many civilians look at him as an outsider, an Igbo man from the east. On market days, the streets overflow with traders speaking different languages, praying in different ways, resenting each other over jobs, land, and rumors. Tiny clashes are smoothed over by local leaders, but tension hums beneath the surface like an electric wire. He keeps the peace with discipline and professionalism, insisting that his men treat civilians with respect. But he also keeps a mental ledger of the insults, the stories of discrimination, the simmering anger he hears whispered in bars and at roadside stalls. History has taught him that such ledgers do not stay unpaid forever. By the mid-1960s, the euphoria of independence has curdled into frustration. Corruption scandals rock the newspapers. Elections are disputed, then openly rigged. In the parliament, accusations fly faster than laws. Outside, ordinary Nigerians feel that the promised future has been stolen almost as soon as it arrived. In the officer corps, there is a sense, spoken in low tones in mess halls, that the politicians are losing control. Emeka's no longer just Louis's son, no longer just the boy who slapped a teacher. He is now Lieutenant Colonel Ojukwu, a senior officer, a man whose decisions move troops across maps. He understands that the army, if it steps into politics, will not simply be a neutral referee. It will be another player, with its own ambitions, its own rivalries. And then, just before dawn one January night in 1966, the country's fragile balance shatters. In the north, his phone rings in the darkness. Reports crackle over the radio. Senior politicians killed, high-ranking officers assassinated in their beds, armored cars moving through, streets that used to belong only to traffic and traders. A group of young officers has launched a coup. The names of the dead begin to filter through. The list is long and chilling. Nigeria's experiment with civilian rule has been cut down by bullets. In his barracks, under the bare bulb of his office, Chukwuemeka Ojukwu has hours, perhaps less, to decide where he stands. Who is now in charge? Which orders are legitimate? How does he protect his men, his region, his own vision of Nigeria? On the other end of the fragile radio network are other officers. Some from the north, some from the west, some from the east. Men he has trained with, marched with, argued with. Somewhere among them, climbing the same ladder, is Yakubu Gowon. A rivalry that began as silent competition on parade grounds is about to become something far more dangerous. The clock that started ticking when he first defied a colonial teacher is now counting down faster. In less than 2 years, the decisions he makes in these shadowed hours will lead to a point of no return. For him, for his rival, and for an entire nation suddenly hanging between unity and ruin. One moment, he is a professional soldier trained to obey the chain of command. The next, there is no chain, no clear command, just crackling radios, dead generals, and a country tearing itself apart along lines. that no bullet can ever fully mend. In the half-light before dawn, with the telephone receiver slick in his hand and rumors of massacres already starting to whisper through, the barracks, Chukwuemeka Odumegwu Ojukwu, realizes something terrifying. If he chooses wrong in the next few hours, Nigeria may not survive the year, and he may have less than 12 months to stop a spiral that has already begun. The first reports of the January 1966 coup arrive in fragments, like pieces of a nightmare. Senior politicians murdered in Lagos. The Prime Minister, Sir Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, missing, then confirmed dead, his body dumped by a roadside. In Kaduna, the powerful premier of the northern region, Ahmadu Bello, gunned down in his home. Armored cars rolling through streets that once saw only taxis and lorries. On the radio, the voice of a young major, Chukwuemeka Odumegwu, comes through with chilling, rehearsed calm, announcing that corrupt leaders have been swept away, that a new dawn has come. He speaks from the north on Ojukwu's turf. For a few breathless minutes, some people cheer. The civilian government had been drowning in corruption and rigged elections. Part of the country exhales in relief. But inside barracks in Kano, where Ojukwu commands a battalion, the mood is very different. The men look at him, waiting. Is this an order to obey or an insurrection to crush? Here's the first twist. Ojukwu is not part of the plot. The coup is led by younger officers, many of them Igbo like him, but acting without his knowledge. To northern eyes, though, the details do not matter. Names of the conspirators are compared with the names of the dead. The list of victims is heavy with northern and western leaders. The list of coup plotters is heavy with Igbo officers. The pattern is too easy to draw and too deadly to erase. On the ground in his barracks, the danger is immediate. His soldiers are mostly from the north. He, their commander, is an Igbo officer. Panic and fury spread through the ranks. Rumors race faster than radio signals. The Igbo want to take over. They've killed our leaders. Their officer here is with them. Ojukwu makes a decision that will define how both his enemies and his supporters see him. He refuses to join the mutiny. He refuses to allow his troops to turn their guns on civilians. He clamps down on chaos with a steel will, ordering his men to stay in barracks, to maintain discipline, to wait for clear authority from higher up. At a moment when others are grabbing power, he is using his to prevent slaughter. Out of the turmoil in Lagos, a new figure emerges. Major General Johnson Thomas Umunakwe Aguiyi Ironsi, the most senior Nigerian officer, a man whose uniforms are familiar to Ojukwu from parades and trainings. Ironsi moves quickly, neutralizing some of the coup plotters, persuading others to stand down. Within days, he appears on radio as Nigeria's new head of state, promising order, unity, and the end of political corruption. Ojukwu accepts Ironsi's authority. It is not a simple choice. It is a gamble on the idea that the army can be a national glue rather than a regional sword. In the eyes of some northern officers, that choice brands him forever. Ironsi, facing a shredded political landscape, needs men he can trust in key regions. In January 1966, he appoints Ojukwu military governor of the eastern region. The move is astonishing. In a country where elders and big men have monopolized power for decades, a 32-year-old suddenly finds himself effectively the ruler of a vast territory filled with oil wells, restless youth, and a history of feeling cheated out of national power. The boy who once slapped a colonial teacher now walks the corridors of Government House in Enugu, the coal city, as the official representative of the state. Government House Enugu is a world away from the mud of parade grounds. High ceilings, polished floors, the Nigerian flag fluttering in a warm breeze over manicured lawns, yet the air around it is heavier than any barracks air. On his desk lie reports of unpaid salaries, ethnic tensions, simmering discontent, problems that cannot be solved with a shouted order or a drill. Ojukwu approaches the job like a campaign. He travels across the region, from the thriving commercial nerve center of Onitsha to the oil-rich creeks of the Niger Delta. In market squares, people climb trees and rooftops to catch a glimpse of their young governor. They listen to his speeches, this officer with an Oxford accent and a soldier's straight back, talking about discipline, justice, and a new Nigeria where no region will be second class. He is intense, demanding, often unforgiving. He sacks officials he considers lazy or corrupt. He insists on tighter financial control. He pushes for more local input in decisions that used to be made in Lagos. In the short, electrified honeymoon after the coup, some begin to believe that maybe, just maybe, the military might deliver where the politicians failed. But far away in the north, other currents are moving. The January coup, whatever its original intent, has left scars. Many northerners see it not as a national correction, but as an ethnic assault. Their leaders have been killed. The man now ruling Nigeria, Ironsi, is Igbo. Several of the most visible coup plotters are Igbo. Some killings of Igbo civilians in northern towns are reported, then dismissed as isolated incidents. At first, the numbers are small. At first, inside the army, the mood grows mutinous. Among the officers nursing their anger is a quiet, competent man from the north, whom Ojukwu knows well, Yakubu Gowon. He has risen steadily, earning a reputation as professional and unflappable. After the coup, Ironsi makes him chief of army staff. On paper, they are part of the same high command. In reality, they are standing on opposite sides of a widening crack. Then Ironsi makes a move that detonates like a bomb. Decree number 34, the Unification Decree, is issued in May 1966. Its goal, at least on paper, is to transform Nigeria from a loose federation of regions into a more centralized unitary state. Civil servants, soldiers, resources, all to be unified under the federal center. To some Southerners and many intellectuals, this promises efficiency. To many in the North, it feels like the last protections of regional autonomy are being stripped away by an Igbo-led government. The propaganda practically writes itself. First, they kill our leaders. Then they take our power. In Enugu, Ojukwu reads the text of the decree. As a student of history, he knows centralization can stabilize or crush. As a governor of a region that has long complained of being milked for its wealth, he is wary. Yet he also believes that a fragmented Nigeria may not survive. He does not publicly break with Ironsi. He tries again to hold contradictions together. One country, many resentments. It doesn't hold. On a July night in 1966, while Ironsi is on a tour in the western region, staying at Government House in Ibadan, northern officers strike back. The coup against the coup. In the dark, guns fire. Ironsi and his host, Lieutenant Colonel Adekunle Fajuyi, are seized, beaten, and murdered. Their bodies are dumped in a shallow grave, the soil roughly kicked over them. The message is clear. The North has taken its revenge. In Enugu, Ojukwu learns of the assassinations not via an orderly signal, but through a mix of panic calls and half-coherent reports. For a few hours, Nigeria has no recognized head. The chain of command he dedicated his life to has been smashed twice in 6 months. On paper, there is a clear line. The next most senior officer is Brigadier Babafemi Ogundipe, a Yoruba in Lagos. By the rules drilled into every officer at Sandhurst, Ogundipe should assume command. But events on the ground are no longer obeying Sandhurst. In Lagos and in northern garrisons, northern officers control the guns. Ogundipe, theoretically their superior, discovers in the most humiliating way that his rank is an empty badge. When he tries to issue orders, a junior northern soldier reportedly points a gun at him and refuses. Real power has slipped. From within this chaos emerges a name. Lieutenant Colonel Yakubu Gowon. He is not the most senior. He does not pretend to be, but he has something more important. Northern backing. Soon a radio broadcast declares him head of state. In Enugu, Ojukwu listens, jaw clenched, to the words over the speaker. The man he had once drilled alongside is now claiming the authority of a position his rank does not justify. It is not just about seniority. It is about the principle that the army must not become a spoil system for whichever region can seize the microphones and barracks. He refuses to recognize Gowon. Over the Eastern Nigeria Broadcasting Service, his own voice goes out over the airwaves, calm but cutting. He speaks of the need for constitutional order, of seniority, of justice. He insists that Nigeria cannot be ruled by mutiny. Between the lines, another message is clear. He will not let the East be dictated to by a government born from the murder of a man he had just recently served under. At that moment, the rivalry between Ojukwu and Gowon crystallizes into something stark. It is no longer friendly competition in training exercises. It is a battle over who gets to define Nigeria's future, and at what cost. The cost begins to appear in blood. In northern cities, this second coup unleashes something much darker than a change of government. It loosens the restraints on hatred. Rumors of Igbo plots multiply. Angry crowds look for scapegoats. Soldiers who lost their leaders in January now look to avenge them on the nearest Igbo civilians. The word pogrom is dry on paper. In reality, it is a market street turned into a killing ground. It is train stations where the only thing more numerous than luggage are bodies. It is lorries arriving in the East, not with goods, but with survivors. Women whose wrappers are stained with blood not their own. Children whose eyes have forgotten how to blink. Between May and October 1966, waves of violence crash over northern towns. Igbo men are dragged from workshops, lined up against walls, shot or hacked to death. Women are attacked in their homes. Children are slaughtered in front of their parents. The number of dead runs into the tens of thousands. Exact figures are contested. The horror is not. For Easterners, one scene becomes a symbol. Trains arriving from the north, packed with those who fled. Some carriages carry the living, silent with shock. Others carry only corpses. In station yards in Enugu and Onitsha, officials peel back tarpaulins to reveal stacks of bodies. The smell of blood and decay hits the waiting crowds like a physical blow. Wails rise, people collapse. Mothers scan faces looking for sons who never step off the train. Ojukwu visits refugee camps that spring up seemingly overnight. Tens of thousands of people sheltering in schools, churches, any building with a roof. Children cry from hunger and nightmares. Men sit staring into nothing, their hands still trembling. The governor who once spoke about discipline now finds himself walking through rows of mats laid on concrete floors, offering what words he can. He is haunted by a single thought. While these people were being killed, a government in Lagos existed. A head of state existed. Orders could have been given, troops could have been deployed, curfews enforced. But the killings went on. In the eyes of many Easterners, Yakubu Gowon has one title now: the man who could not or would not protect them. Inside Government House, the pressure on Ojukwu becomes almost unbearable. Advisors and elders come, sometimes respectfully, sometimes banging fists on his desk. How long, they demand. Do you expect our people to die in a country that calls them citizens, only to butcher them? Governor, we have 6 months, maybe less, before this region collapses under the weight of refugees and fear. If Lagos will not protect us, we must protect ourselves. 6 months. A new clock starts ticking in his head. Not the philosophical clock of history he studied at Oxford, but a brutal countdown measured in corpses and sacks of dwindling grain. Despite everything, he tries once more to rescue the idea of Nigeria. Under international pressure and the anxious gaze of foreign governments that fear the giant of Africa breaking apart, a meeting is arranged in a neutral place, Aburi, a quiet hill town in Ghana. In January 1967, Ojukwu flies out of a tense east, carrying with him not just his own future, but the desperate hope of millions. Gowon flies in from Lagos, the rival now wrapped in the full symbols of state: head of state, commander-in-chief. In a villa surrounded by trees and guarded by Ghanaian soldiers, they face each other across a table. The cameras catch stiff smiles, handshakes, flashes of teeth. When the press is ushered out, the real talking begins. The Aburi discussions stretch for hours, then days. Voices rise, fall, break. The military governors from all regions argue about structure, power, the very definition of the country they are supposed to save. Ojukwu pushes relentlessly for a loose federation, almost a confederation. Strong regional autonomy, a weak federal center, protections for minority groups. If the East is to remain in Nigeria, he insists, it must be as an equal, not as a sacrificial region whose people can be slaughtered in the North without consequence. Gowon, under pressure from his own hardliners, tries to balance. He cannot return to Lagos having surrendered the Federation. He also cannot ignore the carnage that has already taken place. The discussions go deep into the night. At one point, according to some who were there, voices crack not from anger, but from sheer exhaustion. And then, against all expectations, an agreement appears to crystallize: the Aburi Accord. It promises a return of significant powers to the regions, a restructured army command, a mechanism to prevent any one part of the country from imposing its will by force. The men around the table sign, shake hands, pose for renewed photographs. For a moment, it looks like a miracle. Two rivals walking back from the edge. When Ojukwu returns to Enugu, crowds gather to welcome him. The radio stations replay snippets of his statements. People dare to hope that the trains from the north might now carry goods instead of corpses, that the camps might empty, that children might sleep without waking to screams. Then the twist hits. In Lagos, civil servants and legal advisors set to work translating the Aburi Accord into decrees. The language that emerges looks different. Powers that seemed clearly restored to the regions are hedged, qualified, pulled back. The federal center, Gowon's government, keeps more control than the spirit of Aburi would allow. To Eastern eyes, it is betrayal wrapped in bureaucracy. When Ojukwu reads the draft decrees, the anger is icy. To him, this is not merely political maneuvering. It is another sign that the East's security, the lives of those in the refugee camps, are negotiable tokens in Lagos. He goes on the air again, explaining to his people how the spirit of Aburi is being violated. Across the East, people listen with a mix of rage and grim satisfaction. Rage at Lagos, satisfaction that their governor is not backing down. The countdown accelerates. By March and April 1967, economic war joins political war. Gowon's government announces measures that hit the East hard: a blockade of the region's oil revenues, restrictions on trade. Tankers hesitate. Foreign companies grow nervous. The pipelines that snake through Eastern soil no longer guarantee prosperity. They become potential weapons of starvation. In Enugu, Ojukwu and his team respond with frantic speed. They set up a separate financial structure for the East, move toward controlling their own revenue, talk of a new currency. They begin reorganizing the region's security forces into something more than just police, a proto-army. Workshops convert civilian lorries into improvised armored vehicles. Young men line up to enlist, many of them survivors of the northern pogroms, their eyes burning with a desire not for glory but for revenge or safety or both. Every day, reports on his desk grow darker. The refugee camps are swelling. Diseases whisper through the tents and crowded rooms. International aid is uncertain. Recognition of any new political status would be even more uncertain. His advisors remind him, "We cannot survive like this for much longer. If a decision is not taken soon, the decision will be made for us, by hunger or by invasion." The time horizon shrinks. 6 months becomes 3. 3 becomes before the rains end, before roads become passable for tanks and artillery. And so, in late May 1967, in the hall of the Eastern Nigeria House of Assembly, under ceiling fans that push warm air in slow circles, Ojukwu stands before regional representatives and invited guests. Outside, thousands crowd around, filling the streets of Enugu, clinging to window frames, hanging from trees. Radios are tuned, volumes turned up. The tension is physical, like the moments before a storm breaks. He reads a declaration. The words have been drafted, argued over, polished, but as he speaks them, they sound less like law and more like a verdict, that the eastern region of Nigeria is hereby declared a sovereign and independent Republic of Biafra. The name, Biafra, drawn from the ancient Bight of Biafra, off the Atlantic coast, fills the hall like a drumbeat. Some applaud wildly, some weep. Outside, when the news filters out, people erupt. Men tear their old Nigerian flags, women ululate, children shout the new name over and over. For a people who have felt hunted in their own country, the word Biafra feels like a shield suddenly thrown up between them and the world. For Ojukwu, the moment is far from triumphant. As he finishes the declaration, he knows what must follow. He knows that in Lagos, Gowon and his advisors will hear the broadcast and see not a shield, but a challenge. He knows that foreign embassies will send cables home. Nigeria has split. War likely. He knows that the time he has bought his people is not measured in years, but in weeks. In Lagos, Gowon appears on radio soon after, his own voice calm but unyielding. He announces that the action of the eastern region is illegal, that the unity of Nigeria is non-negotiable. He orders a police action to restore order in the east, a phrase that sounds almost gentle, until you remember that the police he commands are soldiers, and the action will be measured in artillery shells. Maps and military headquarters across Nigeria are redrawn overnight. Where there was once one country, there are now 2 colors, 2 armies, 2 capitals. Old comrades glance at those maps and realize that the men they once shared jokes and drills with are now on the wrong side of a line that did not exist a year ago. In Enugu, Ojukwu scarcely sleeps. Government House becomes a war room. Tables covered not with economic plans but with maps marked in pencil, arrows showing potential invasion routes. He meets with his new commanders, some professional, some improvised from the ranks of volunteers, assigning scarce resources, deciding where to place the few artillery pieces Biafra possesses, how to defend against an air force he knows he cannot match. Outside, volunteers dig trenches, fill sandbags, stack stones into crude barricades. Tailors stitch new patches onto uniforms. The rising sun emblem of Biafra, bright and defiant. Children practice crouching at the sound of imagined bombers. Mothers rehearse how to grab their babies and run. The man who once studied the collapse of empires in quiet Oxford libraries now has days, maybe months at best, to build a new state, under siege, to forge an army out of trauma and hope, and to face a rival whose government commands more men, more guns, more planes. Hey, and crucially, the recognition of most of the world. Somewhere to the north, federal troops begin to move, boots pounding dust, engines rumbling. On radio frequencies crowded with static, coded messages crackle back and forth. Along the borders between Nigeria and the newborn Biafra, young soldiers peer through the trees, fingers on triggers, hearts beating too fast. When the first shot is finally fired across that invisible line, no one will agree later who pulled it or exactly where. It is almost a relief. The waiting is over. The race that began with a phone ringing in the dark in January 1966 has turned into open war. And at the center of it, with a stopwatch of history ticking somewhere only he can hear it, stands Chukwuemeka Odumegwu Ojukwu. No longer just the millionaire's son, no longer just a governor, now the head of state of a breakaway republic, locked in a deadly contest, with Yakubu Gowon for the soul, the map, and the survival of a nation that, only a year before, still pretended to be one. The first artillery shells do not land on a battlefield. They land in people's heads. For weeks, both sides have been talking about police action, about a quick operation, about restoring order. Then, one morning in July 1967, the sky over the northern edge of Biafra cracks open. Federal shells slam into dusty fields near Nsukka, throwing earth and metal into the air. Villagers grab their children and run, without knowing where the front line is, because no one has drawn it for them. At the same time, in Enugu, a clock on Ojukwu's wall ticks with irritating normality, as if it has not just become a countdown to the end of everything he knows. Reports rush in, jagged and incomplete. Federal troops have crossed the border. Some Biafran units hold, others fall back in confusion. Radios squeal. Names of captains and majors he has only recently promoted come at him, each name attached to a question. Do we stay? Do we retreat? Do we burn what we cannot carry? This is the first cruel twist of leadership in war. The man the world now calls head of state does not command an army. He is trying to assemble one in real time as enemy shells are already falling. In a cramped operations room inside Government House, Ojukwu leans over maps that look almost childish. Roads drawn in pencil, villages marked by hand, improvised symbols for units that exist mostly on paper. Around him stand officers in mismatched uniforms. Some are professionals from the old Nigerian army. Others are local militia leaders who, a year ago, were school teachers or engineers. How long can Nsukka hold? He asks. A colonel clears his throat. With ammunition, 2 weeks. Without, he lets the sentence die. 2 weeks, 14 days. In the airless room, the number feels like an hourglass turned upside down in front of everyone. He knows Gowon is under pressure too. In Lagos, the head of state has promised the country that the rebellion will be crushed quickly, that the misguided East will be brought back into the fold. Gowon's generals assure him that Biafra is small, that it cannot last more than a few months against the weight of the Federation. For both men, the timetable is part of the war. If Gowon's police action drags on, his government will look weak. If Ojukwu cannot prove that Biafra can defend itself, his own people will lose faith and die. The first days are chaos, but not all the news is bad. Biafran forces fight stubbornly around Nsukka and Ogoja. They are outgunned but not always outmatched. Many have seen their families butchered in the north. Retreat is not just a military maneuver to them. It is surrendering their homes to the same fate. Some positions that were expected to fall in hours hold for days. From Enugu, Ojukwu uses every tool he has to create the illusion and then the reality of cohesion. He speaks on Radio Biafra almost daily, his voice measured, his English precise, talking not like a demagogue, but like a teacher furious at injustice, explaining why this is not a war of secession, but a war of survival. Now, he insists that the conflict is not against ordinary Nigerians, especially not minorities in the Midwest and the rivers. It is against a federal government that has, in his view, broken every promise of safety. He also works like an administrator on fire. Ministries that did not exist a month ago must now function under bombardment. Petrol is rationed. Food supplies are counted down to the last bag of rice. Doctors are summoned and told bluntly, "We have no time to build hospitals. Turn schools into clinics, churches into wards. Do what you can with what you have." In converted classrooms, under chalkboards that still carry old lessons, nurses prepare for casualties they have no equipment to properly treat. The external battlefield opens almost as quickly as the internal one. Diplomatic cables begin to crisscross Africa and Europe. Gowon's government tells the world, Nigeria must remain one. Any recognition of Biafra will encourage chaos across the continent. Ojukwu, in turn, sends envoys to neighboring states, appealing to memories of colonial injustices, to the principle that a people under genocide cannot be asked to return quietly to their killers. Telephone lines crackle between Enugu and Abidjan, Enugu and Libreville, Enugu and Dar es Salaam. Some leaders listen in sympathy but fear Nigeria's size. Others, like Felix Houphouët-Boigny of Ivory Coast and Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, find themselves unable to ignore the refugee trains and the stories from the north. In time, they, and later Gabon and distant Haiti, will recognize Biafra, tiny islands of legitimacy in an ocean of diplomatic isolation. For now, recognition does something crucial. It tells Ojukwu that he has not lost the argument in every capital. It tells his people that the word Biafra is not just a slogan shouted in markets, but a name that appears in foreign communiques and newspapers. Yet each diplomatic victory is paid for in territory. Federal troops take Nsukka, they push toward Enugu. Air raids begin, crude but terrifying, as pilots trained for reconnaissance now drop bombs on bridges, markets, sometimes hitting. Nothing but empty fields, other times turning crowds into scattered bodies. Ojukwu orders anti-aircraft guns to be moved, camouflaged, improvised from whatever can fire into the sky. He visits bomb sites himself, stepping over shattered glass and twisted metal, listening to survivors' stories until his staff have to pull him away to the next briefing. In one ruined market, standing where burnt yams still smoke, an old woman grabs his sleeve. "You said we would be safe here," she cries. "You said Biafra would protect us." He cannot promise her safety now. All he can promise is struggle. He understands, perhaps more clearly than anyone, that the new republic has bet its existence on his decisions. Military, diplomatic, moral. Gowon has generals. Ojukwu has history bearing down on his shoulders. Then, in August 1967, he makes one of his most daring moves. Instead of merely defending, Biafra strikes out. Under a plan that shocks even some of his own officers, Biafran forces cross the Niger and sweep into the Midwest region, capturing Benin City with astonishing speed. Federal units melt away or are taken by surprise. In a matter of days, what seemed like a contained conflict in the east becomes a war deep inside Nigeria's territory. On maps in Lagos, bright lines of Biafran advance suddenly appear where no one expected them. In Enugu, the news is greeted with jubilation. On Radio Biafra, Ojukwu frames the offensive not as conquest, but as a way to carry the war away from Biafran soil, to give the East breathing space while sending a message to Gowon. You are not untouchable. For a fleeting moment, it works. Panic ripples through the federal government. There is talk, whispered then louder, of Biafran units potentially pushing toward Lagos itself. But this is the second brutal law of war. What moves fast can also overextend. Biafran forces in the Midwest are a thin spear thrust into a larger body. Supply lines stretch. Local populations are uncertain. Some welcome the newcomers, others resent them. Still others are simply afraid. Internal disagreements among Biafran commanders surface, and Gowon, who has seemed hesitant, now finds steel in the face of the threat. Federal troops regroup. They counterattack with superior numbers and firepower. The road to Ore, which for a moment represented a spectacular possibility, becomes a corridor of retreat. Biafran units pull back in haste, leaving equipment and, more painfully, bodies. In Enugu, Ojukwu receives the reports with a face carved from stone. The same newspapers abroad that marveled at Biafra's audacity now talk of overreach. Inside Biafra, some quietly question whether the Midwest offensive was genius or folly. He does not defend himself publicly. He cannot afford the luxury. He has to absorb the blow, adjust, move. As 1967 turns into 1968, the war settles into a grinding siege. Federal troops tighten the noose, capturing Port Harcourt, cutting Biafra's access to the sea. With each lost city, the map on Ojukwu's wall shrinks. What began as a region the size of a small European country is reduced, month by month, to a rough oval of land ringed by enemy positions. The time limit that once seemed political now becomes biological. In strategy meetings, he no longer asks only, "How many days can that brigade hold?" He asks, "How many weeks of food do we have left for the civilians if this road is cut?" In one chilling session, his economic advisors lay it out bluntly. Without external supplies, without a corridor for relief, children in some areas will begin to starve within 3 months. 3 months, 90 days. Each one of them heavier than all the years he spent at Oxford, in Sandhurst, in colonial barracks. This is when the images that will define Biafra in the world's memory appear. Children with swollen bellies and stick-thin arms. Mothers whose breasts have no milk. Villages where people move slowly, conserving energy, because every unnecessary step is a theft from their own survival. It is not that there is no food anywhere. It is that the war has shattered the systems that move grain from one place to another. Roads are bombed or blocked. Farmers are on the front lines or in refugee camps. Gowon's government imposes a blockade to weaken the rebels. They call it strategy. In Biafra, it feels like strangulation. Ojukwu uses every contact, every scrap of international goodwill, to break this invisible noose. He authorizes the building of a secret lifeline, an airstrip near the town of Uli, carved out of an old highway, camouflaged so that, from the sky, it looks like nothing. At night, in almost total darkness, relief planes from church organizations and sympathetic countries risk federal anti-aircraft fire to land on this narrow strip of tarmac. They bring in powdered milk, medicine, sometimes weapons. They fly out orphans, the critically sick, journalists who will tell the world what they have seen. More than once, Ojukwu drives to Uli in the middle of the night, standing at the edge of the runway as a ghostly aircraft descends. With its lights off, guided only by flickering torches, he helps carry boxes into waiting trucks, his white shirt stained with dust and sweat. For a man born into immense wealth, whose early life was smoothed by his father's money, there is an almost savage satisfaction in This raw, improvised struggle, inside Biafra, he pushes for something else as vital as food: unity. The new republic is not only Igbo, it includes minorities from the rivers, Cross River, and other areas. Federal propaganda tries to exploit old grievances, telling them that Biafra is an Igbo plot to dominate them. Ojukwu responds with fiery speeches insisting on equality, on shared suffering. He meets delegations of minority leaders, listens to complaints about past Igbo arrogance, and sometimes answers with an apology as sharp as any command. Then let us build a different future now, or there will be no future at all. He also demands discipline from his own generals. When rumors of looting or civilian abuses by Biafran troops reach him, he summons commanders, bangs his fist on the table, and reminds them that the moral high ground is not a slogan. It is their only shield in a world that officially backs Nigeria's unity. In some cases, he orders courts-martial. The message is clear. Fighting for survival does not give you the right to become the thing you hate. Yet the strain shows. By 1969, Biafra is a wounded animal, cornered but still baring its teeth. New weapons, like the locally developed Ogbunigwe mines, prove that necessity can breed terrifying innovation. Biafran engineers distill fuel from palm oil, improvise machine tools, turn scrap into weapons. We must think with the urgency of men who may not see next year, Ojukwu tells a group of technicians, his voice hoarse from another long night. At the same time, internal cracks appear. Some officers and politicians whisper that the war is unwinnable, that Ojukwu's stubbornness is prolonging suffering. A few attempt intrigues. One plot to replace him collapses when its leaders misjudge the loyalty of the army. He reacts ruthlessly, ordering arrests, sometimes executions. To outside observers, this hardens his image. Not just a tragic leader, but an uncompromising one. He is aware of the criticism. He carries it like shrapnel in his mind. In May 1969, he issues the Ahiara Declaration, a long, dense document that reads like a mix of war manifesto and political sermon. In it, he tries to define what Biafra stands for beyond survival: social justice, an end to corruption, a rejection of the old Nigerian politics of big men buying loyalty. It is as if, in the middle of bombardment, he is still trying to save not just a people, but an idea. But ideas do not stop bombs. Federal forces, rearmed and retrained with foreign help, continue to advance. Piece by piece, Biafra shrinks again. Towns that once teemed with refugees empty as people move inward, always inward, chasing the receding illusion of safety. Relief flights become riskier as federal anti-aircraft guns move closer. Each night, Ojukwu's staff wait for news. Did the planes make it? Did they crash into the dark bush with their precious cargo? The rivalry with Gowon has by now become almost abstract. The two men do not meet. They do not speak except through communiques and radio broadcasts. Yet each lives with the other's shadow. Gowon, in Lagos, reviews casualty figures, balances war expenses, worries about the image of Nigeria abroad as photographs of starving. Biafran children appear in European and American newspapers. Ojukwu, in the ever-shrinking heart of Biafra, reads those same newspapers and wonders how long moral outrage can compete with oil and geopolitics. Both know that time is not neutral. It is fighting for or against them. Late in 1969, the clock that has been ticking since that night of the first coup seems to speed up. Biafran defenses are stretched thinner than paper. Ammo stockpiles are measured not in months, but in days. Some units go into battle with only a handful of rounds per man. In villages, people have stopped counting meals by the day. They count by the week, by the month. We last ate meat 2 months ago. Diseases previously unknown to most villagers now have names everyone knows: kwashiorkor, marasmus. Inside his headquarters, Ojukwu stares at a set of figures his finance and logistics officers have prepared. They are simple: projected food and fuel supplies versus current rate of consumption over the next 6 weeks. 6 weeks. If the fronts do not hold, those 6 weeks will become 3. If relief flights are cut off, 3 will become none. He realizes that he no longer controls the pace of the war. The decision that has haunted him from the beginning, how long to fight, at what cost, and when to choose negotiation over resistance, has stopped being a distant philosophical question. It is pressing in on him like the walls of a tunnel narrowing. His rival, Gowon, has his own timetable. End the war before another Christmas. End the war before the oil fields suffer lasting damage. The two clocks, one in Lagos and one in the beleaguered Biafran enclave, tick towards the same point. A final confrontation not of armies, but of choices. In the last days of December 1969, the air in Biafra feels thicker, as if even oxygen is running out. New offensives slam into the remaining towns. Uli airstrip, the fragile umbilical cord to the outside world, is bombed repeatedly. Pilots who once joked nervously on landing now refuse missions, telling organizers bluntly that to fly is to die. In hurried meetings, advisors argue in raised voices about what must happen next. Some urge immediate negotiations, a ceasefire at any price. Others, eyes burning with despair disguised as courage, shout that surrender will mean massacres, trials, the erasure of everything they have suffered for. Ojukwu listens, silent, his face showing little, but inside, the argument is tearing through him as viciously as any shrapnel. He knows that within days, perhaps hours, he will have to make a choice that will define not only his own life, but how history will pronounce his name. Rebel who doomed his people, or leader who, at the last moment, sacrificed his own ambition to save those he could still save. Outside, under a sky that has seen too many flares and too few stars, the last nights of Biafra pass in a strange mixture of routine and dread. Mothers still hush children to sleep. Soldiers still clean their rifles. Radios still crackle. Somewhere, in a bunker lit by a single bulb, Chukwuemeka Odumegwu Ojukwu bends over a map that has almost no space left to shrink, listening to the ticking of a clock that no one else can hear. As the war he started to stop, a slaughter threatens to swallow everything it was meant to protect. The most shocking decision of Chukwuemeka Odumegwu Ojukwu's life is not the one to go to war. It is the one to walk away from it. In the first days of January 1970, inside a bunker that smells of sweat, kerosene, and fear, he sits at a metal table marked by cigarette, burns, and compass scratches. The map before him is no longer a map of a country. It is a map of collapse. Federal forces are closing in from north, south, and west. Uli airstrip, his fragile artery to the outside world, is being pounded day and night. Reports on his desk talk not about positions and strategic points, but about villages where entire families have not eaten in days. Outside, officers argue in tight, furious circles. Sir, we can still hold out for a few weeks. With what? Stones? If we surrender now, they will slaughter us all. You know what they did in the north? You know, words like honor, genocide, futility crackle in the air. The room is hot, but some men shiver. On the other side of the lines, in Lagos, Yakubu Gowon is under a different kind of heat. Pressure from allies, from oil companies, from communities who want their sons back from the front. Pressure to end the war without creating a martyr. His clock is ticking too. Finish this before the world loses patience. Finish this before Nigeria itself begins to fracture. The rivalry between the two men has become almost geometric. One shrinking enclave versus one expanding federation. One bearded rebel general versus one youthful head of state in stiff khaki. Now that rivalry condenses into a single brutal question. Who will define how this war ends? A trusted advisor leans toward Ojukwu in the bunker. Your Excellency, if you stay, you may die. If you are killed, the fighting will continue without direction. If you leave, the others can negotiate. You might save more lives by not being here. The words feel poisonous. Leave. The man whose face is on posters, whose speeches have hardened people's resolve, whose name mothers have whispered to their starving children as a kind of promise, leave. He stares at the map. His fingers trace rivers that have become front lines, towns that now exist mainly as lists of casualties. He thinks of the old woman in the bombed market who grabbed his sleeve and said, "You said we would be safe here." He thinks of the thin children lifting hollow eyes to relief planes. A different kind of time limit appears in his mind. Not 6 weeks of food, not 3 months of fuel, hours. That is all Uli has left before federal troops and bombers make escape impossible. There is one more flight that can get out. Perhaps two. After that, the war will end with him trapped inside it. In the darkness before dawn, engines cough on the airstrip that has lived a double life, as a road by day and as a runway by night. The tarmac is pitted, the surrounding bush scarred by bomb craters. Men move like shadows, loading a small aircraft. The pilot's face is pale in the weak light. If we don't leave by first light, we don't leave, the pilot says. Ojukwu stands at the edge of the strip for a moment, listening. Insects, distant thud of artillery, murmurs of the officers who will stay behind. His chest feels heavy, as if someone has placed a stone inside it. What kind of leader leaves his people? A voice in his head demands. What kind of leader insists on dying with them when he could save them by surrendering power? Another voice answers. He has led men into battle. Now he has to lead himself into exile. He climbs the small ladder into the aircraft. The metal skin is cold under his hand. At the top, he turns and looks back. In the faint glow of hooded lamps, he sees faces. Some tearful, some expressionless, all exhausted. He raises his hand. It is not a salute. It is something more naked than that. A gesture that says, I am trusting you to do what I no longer can. The engines roar. The plane accelerates down the makeshift runway. For a heartbeat, it feels as if it will never lift, as if the tarmac will hold it down the way history has tried to hold down his people. Then with a shudder it rises. The land of Biafra falls away under the wings. Black squares of farmland, thin lines of roads, clusters of tin-roofed houses, all shrinking in the window as if someone is rolling up a map. In that moment, the man who refused to bend to Nigeria is reduced to a small, moving dot in the African sky, hurtling toward uncertainty. The plane lands in Ivory Coast, a country he has never called home, now the only place that will have him. President Félix Houphouët-Boigny receives him not as a defeated rebel, but as a political exile, a symbol. The Ivorian leader offers asylum, a villa, a measure of dignity. Yet exile is a kind of slow suffocation. There are no bombers overhead, no starving crowds at the gate, but the silence presses in just as hard. He wakes in a foreign bedroom, the sheets clean, the air conditioned. No distant artillery, no urgent knock on the door, no aide saying, "Your Excellency, the commander from the southern front is here." Instead, birds traffic. The clink of cutlery from a careful breakfast set out by staff who address him with respect, but not urgency. His hands, used to pointing at maps and slamming on tables, now hover uselessly over books and newspapers. News from Nigeria arrives in fragments. A radio crackles with the voice of his deputy, Philip Effiong, announcing surrender in his absence. Ojukwu stands very still as he listens. "We have therefore instructed our troops to lay down their arms." Effiong's voice says, steady but heavy. The words are an echo of the decision Ojukwu had already made in the sky. The war is over. Then Gowon's voice comes, carried over shortwave and print. The head of state declares there will be no victor, no vanquished. He speaks of reconciliation, of 3 R's: rehabilitation, reconstruction, reconciliation. He offers a general amnesty to most Biafran soldiers and civilians. It is a twist no one predicted in the darkest days of the fighting. The man who commanded the army that strangled Biafra now telling the world that Nigeria will not seek mass revenge. From Abidjan, Ojukwu listens with a bitter, complicated taste in his mouth. Part of him is relieved. It means that families he left behind may not face massacres. Another part burns. No victor, no vanquished sounds generous. But the facts on the ground are blunt. Biafra is gone. The Federation remains. One clock ran out before the other. He becomes a man divided between newspapers and memories. In public, he receives visitors, gives careful interviews, poses for photographs with African leaders. In private, he replays decisions like a film he cannot turn off. The Midwest Offensive. The insistence on fighting when the blockade tightened. The midnight drives to Uli. The departure. At night, he sometimes dreams of the last days of the war. The map shrinking, the last plane. He wakes up in Ivory Coast, heart pounding, in a room that smells of polished wood and French perfume instead of dust and fear. For a long moment, he does not know which reality is more unreal, the lost republic or this comfortable prison of exile. Time, which once defined his every move in hours and days. Holden Suka for 2 weeks, food for 3 months, 6 weeks left. Now stretches and blurs, years slide past, marked not by offensives and communiques, but by quiet birthdays and news clippings. He reads of Nigeria changing, of oil money flooding into Lagos, of bridges and refineries, of coups that topple Gowon himself, sending his old rival into his own exile. That twist, both men who fought for control of one country, now sitting in different foreign cities, stripped of their power, would be funny if it were not so cruel. From Ivory Coast, Ojukwu watches his enemy become, in a strange way, his mirror. He is not completely cut off from home. Eastern Nigerians, especially Igbos, pass through Abidjan to see him. Businessmen, students, priests. They bring stories of survival and adaptation, of discrimination and resilience. Some blame him quietly for the war. Others call him our general, with undimmed affection. A young man once kneels before him and kisses his hand. "You are the reason we still have pride," the visitor says. Ojukwu pulls him up sharply. "Pride without food is a curse," he answers. "Make sure your children eat before you teach them my name." He marries in exile, builds a family, invests in businesses, reads voraciously, yet the idea of return circles him like a restless bird. How long can he stay away before Nigeria forgets him? How long before his story is written completely by others? By those who won, by foreign journalists, by politicians who were still children when the first coup exploded? The time limit reappears in a new form. Not days of ammunition, but years of relevance. In 1982, more than a decade after he left, a new Nigerian president, Shehu Shagari, announces that Ojukwu is free to come home. The amnesty that Gowon once withheld from him personally is finally extended. The message might as well be a starting pistol. You can return, but history will not wait forever. He knows there is risk, Old enemies may still resent him. Hardliners in the army may see him as a threat. But he also knows that another kind of danger is even greater. Dying in a foreign land, remembered only in songs and whispered stories. His voice forever secondhand. He decides. When his plane touches down in Lagos in 1982, the air is thick with heat and anticipation. Security is tight, but they cannot screen out emotion. Crowds have been gathering since dawn, filling the airport road, climbing onto roofs, waving branches and flags. Many of them were children during the war. Some are veterans. Some simply know his name, the way one knows a legend. He steps out in a simple suit, beard flecked with gray. For a heartbeat, the crowd is quiet, as if they are checking that he is real. Then a roar ripples through the air. Ojukwu! Ojukwu! It is as if a ghost has stepped back into daylight. Television cameras track him. Reporters push microphones forward. He smiles, but there is an old seriousness in his eyes. The man who once declared a new republic now declares something much simpler. I have returned to Nigeria to play my full part in its development. Twist upon twist. The former secessionist leader, the enemy of the state, now talking about building the very state he once tried to leave. Not everyone is pleased. Some politicians worry that his charisma, especially in the East, will disrupt their calculations. Former soldiers on the federal side mutter that he should have faced a tribunal, not a welcome. Ojukwu, however, has never been good at staying on the sidelines. Within a year, he joins the ruling party, the National Party of Nigeria, NPN. He runs for Senate in his home area, hoping to convert his symbolic capital into political power. His posters go up on cracked walls. His image, once on revolutionary banners, now appears on ordinary campaign handbills. But ballots are more slippery than bullets. The election is chaotic, marred by allegations of fraud nationwide. In his own contest, he loses, or is declared to have lost, by a margin many find suspicious. For a man used to commanding loyalty, the idea that he can be defeated by the mysterious arithmetic of electoral politics feels both insulting and absurd. He is still processing this new kind of setback when the ground shifts again. On the last day of 1983, soldiers move in the night. Tanks roll. Radio stations are seized. The civilian government is swept aside by a coup led by Major General Muhammadu Buhari. The new regime begins arresting politicians it accuses of corruption and misrule. Ojukwu, who has barely had time to relearn Nigerian political life, finds himself swept into its darkest corner. He is arrested, detained without trial. The man who once commanded an army is now locked behind bars, his movements dictated by warders, his world reduced to a cell and a small exercise yard. It is a grim echo of Biafra in miniature. Confinement, uncertainty, waiting for decisions made by other men far away. Why am I here? He asks a military interrogator. For your role in corrupting the political process, comes the dry reply. He almost laughs. I spent years fighting a war, and you imprisoned me for posters and rallies? Days in detention blur. He marks time again, not by offensives, but by the way sunlight moves across the wall. The time limit that haunts him now is internal. How much longer can his body and spirit endure these cycles of rise, fall, fall? After about a year, he is released. No trial, no formal conviction. Just another twist in a life that has refused all straight lines. The Nigeria he walks back into is harsher, more suspicious. Yet in the East, his stature has not faded. If anything, prison has burnished it. He begins a slow transformation from a figure of war into something more complicated. An elder statesman for a region that still feels the scars of the conflict, a voice who can say things others only whisper. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, as Nigeria returns again to civilian rule, he finds a new political home in the All Progressives. Grand Alliance, APGA, a party with a strong Igbo base. The old general, now in his 60s and 70s, becomes its moral center. He campaigns, speaks at rallies, lends his name and presence. In 2003 and 2007, he even runs for president of Nigeria. The sight is almost surreal. The man whose declaration of Biafra once shattered Nigeria's map is now on national television asking all Nigerians, from Sokoto to Calabar, from Lagos to Maiduguri, to vote for him as their head of state. His campaigns do not win the presidency. The results give him only a fraction of the vote. But the act itself is a kind of statement. I am not outside this country anymore. I am contesting within it, on your terms, with my history visible. That the rivalry with Gowon has long since shifted from battlefields to memory. Years after the war, the two men meet face to face at public events. Church gatherings, anniversaries, reconciliation ceremonies. Cameras flash, commentators murmur, people lean forward, eager to see if sparks will fly. Instead, what they see is something quieter and far more unexpected. At one such event, they shake hands. Gowon, older and softer around the edges, offers a small smile. Ojukwu, leaning on a cane, looks at him steadily. We have both grown older, Gowon says. Only our hair has, Ojukwu replies dryly. The memories are still young. The audience laughs, tension broken. For a moment, the two men stand side by side, not as general and rebel leader, but as survivors of a history that almost consumed them. The cameras capture the image. Two former enemies, both out of power, both trying in their own ways to steer their country toward a future that will not repeat their past. In private conversations and public lectures, Ojukwu does not renounce Biafra. He insists that the cause, a people's right to live without fear of slaughter, was just, but he's also capable of something rarer than stubbornness. Reflection. He talks about mistakes, about the limits of military solutions, about the necessity of political inclusiveness. Our tragedy, he says in one interview, is not that we fought. Our tragedy is that we built a country that made such a fight seem necessary. As the years advance, the clock that once measured campaigns and elections begins to measure something more relentless. His health. He suffers illness, including a stroke. The man who once paced command rooms and stomped across airstrips now moves slowly, sometimes in a wheelchair. His voice, once booming across Radio Biafra, grows softer, occasionally slurred. But when he speaks, people still lean in. They know they are listening to someone whose life has crossed more fault lines than most nations ever see. In late 2011, in a hospital far from the dust and heat of the war, machines beep rhythmically around him. Doctors and nurses move with professional efficiency. Tubes run from his body to bags and monitors. The battle for his life is now invisible, fought in blood pressure readings and oxygen levels. Outside that room, Nigeria is noisy as ever. Traffic jams, political arguments, football matches, music blasting from roadside stalls. Many of the young people buying phone credit at street corners or arguing about European football were not born when Biafra fell. They know his name from textbooks, from their parents' stories, from faded posters on their grandparents' walls. On November 26, 2011, the man whose decisions once moved armies and whose exile once shifted African diplomacy breathes his last. He dies, not in a bunker, not on a battlefield, not at the hands of firing squad or assassin, but in a hospital bed. For a life that flirted so often with sudden, violent endings, this quiet departure is itself one final twist. News of his death flashes across channels and websites. Ojukwu is dead. Tributes pour in, from political allies and opponents, from Igbo communities, from ordinary Nigerians who only knew him as a symbol. Some call him a hero, some call him a tragic figure, some call him both, sometimes in the same sentence. His body is brought back to the east with elaborate ceremony, coffin draped, soldiers in polished boots, traditional dancers, priests, politicians who once avoided him now line up to be seen near his casket. In towns and villages, people stand by the roadside as the convoy passes, some making the sign of the cross, some simply staring, as if trying to reconcile the wooden box with the roaring stories they heard as children. At his burial in Niue, the crowd is thick, the emotions thicker. Old veterans with faded Biafran badges pinned inside their jackets wipe their eyes discreetly. Young men in football jerseys and dark glasses watch with curiosity, aware that they are in the presence of a history that feels both distant and unfinished. The man laid into the red earth is no longer the bearded commander of Uli Knights, no longer the exiled politician in Abidjan salons, no longer the presidential candidate on dusty campaign trucks. He is something more fragile and more enduring, a story that people will argue about for decades. Was he the man who almost broke Nigeria? Or the man who forced it to confront its own brutality? Was he an uncompromising idealist who sacrificed too much? Or a flawed leader who did the best he could with impossible choices? Did his rivalry with Gowon doom millions? Or did it, in its strange ending, with amnesty, with no victor, no vanquished, with old enemies shaking hands, save the country from an even darker abyss? History does not answer in one voice. It rarely does. But somewhere, in the memory of those who saw children's bellies swell with hunger and planes land in the dark at Uli, in the minds of those who watched him return from exile and stand on Nigerian soil with eyes that had seen both the height of command and the depth of defeat, one simple, uncomfortable truth remains. Chukwuemeka Odumegwu Ojukwu lived his life racing against clocks that no one else could fully see. War clocks, political clocks, biological clocks. He won some races, he lost others. He left behind a country still trying to decide which of those races mattered most. And for as long as Nigerians argue about justice, about belonging, about the price of unity, his shadow will keep moving quietly along, the edges of their conversations, like a man walking the perimeter of a map that is never quite finished.